39 seconds. That is all the time that passed between the first earthquake and the second one. 39 seconds between a magnitude 7, 2, and a magnitude 7. 5, striking the same region on the same evening while millions of people were still reacting to the first shock. It happened on June 24th, 2026, on the southern edge of the Caribbean, and it has already become one of the deadliest disasters this hemisphere has seen in over a decade. But here's the part of this story that should have your full attention right now. The shaking has not stopped. In the weeks since those twin earthquakes, the ground across the region has kept moving. Aftershocks have rattled the disaster zone again and again, sending survivors running back into the streets. And just in the past days, seismic monitors registered a magnitude 6. 4 event near the coast of Venezuela, one of the strongest tremors in the region since the main disaster, which raises the question that seismologists across the Caribbean are now being asked, and the question this entire video exists to answer honestly. Is more activity coming? Is this new, shaking a fault system slowly calming down? Or is it a warning that something larger is still in motion beneath the Caribbean? The answer is more complicated, and frankly more unsettling than most of the coverage is telling you. So stay with me, because by the end of this video you will understand exactly what happened, why it happened where it did, what the ground is doing right now, and what the science actually says about what comes next. If you want deep, honest breakdowns of real events like this every single week, subscribe now, because this is exactly what we do on this channel. Let us go back to that evening and walk through it, because the details matter. It was June 24th at 6:04 p.m. local time. Across Venezuela, people were finishing their workdays, sitting down to dinner, riding buses home, and then, deep beneath the state of Yaracuy, west of the capital Caracas, a fault ruptured. The first earthquake measured magnitude 7. 2 at a depth of about 20 kilometers. On its own, that would have been a major disaster. A 7.2 is a powerful, damaging earthquake by any standard. But the ground had barely finished moving from the first shock when the second one hit. Roughly 39 seconds later, a magnitude 7. 5 tore loose nearby, at a depth of only about 10 kilometers, shallower, stronger. And to understand why that second number matters so much, you need to understand how the magnitude scale actually works, because it is not what most people assume. The scale is logarithmic, not linear. A 7, 5 is not just a little bigger than a 7. 2, each step up the scale multiplies the energy released. And a shallow earthquake is far more dangerous than a deep one, because there is less rock between the rupture and the people standing on the surface. So what Venezuela experienced was not one earthquake. It was a 1-2 punch, with the harder hit landing second, on buildings that had already been weakened, on people who had already been thrown off their feet before anyone had a chance to get anywhere safe. The shaking did not stay in Venezuela. It was felt in Bogota, across northeastern Colombia, and deep into northern Brazil, including the cities of Manaus and Belém, where buildings were evacuated. It was felt in Aruba, Bonaire, and Curaçao. It reached parts of the Dominican Republic, including Santo Domingo, and it was felt in Puerto Rico. Think about that footprint for a moment. One rupture in Yaracuy state, and the ground moved across an arc spanning thousands of kilometers, touching multiple countries and island nations across the Caribbean basin. A tsunami advisory went out for the Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, and the Virgin Islands. That advisory was later canceled, and the actual waves that arrived were small, only a few centimeters. But for a tense stretch of that evening, coastlines across the eastern Caribbean were on alert, waiting to find out whether the sea was coming. And in Venezuela itself, the destruction was catastrophic. The hardest hit area was the coastal state of La Guaira, where an estimated 80% of buildings collapsed. 80%. Picture your own town, and then picture 8 out of every 10 buildings on your street down. The confirmed death toll has climbed past 4,900 people, with more than 16,700 injured, and tens of thousands still unaccounted for. This was the strongest earthquake to strike Venezuela since the year 1900. More than a century of seismic history, and nothing in living memory compares. Hospitals in the capital were overwhelmed, and at least 8 hospitals in or near Caracas were forced to close because of structural damage, transferring their patients to clinics that were still standing. The United States Geological Survey warned from the very first hours that high casualties and extensive damage were probable, and one reason they were so certain is grim but important. Many buildings in the affected region are made from unreinforced brick masonry and adobe, materials that are particularly vulnerable in strong shaking. When the ground moves violently under a building like that, the walls do not flex. They shatter. Now here is where this story turns from a tragedy into a scientific question that affects the entire Caribbean. Because the obvious question is, why there? Why Venezuela? Most people do not think of the Caribbean as earthquake country. They think of beaches and hurricanes. But the truth is that the entire Caribbean sits on its own tectonic plate, a relatively small slab of the Earth's crust caught between giants. To the north and east, the North American plate. To the south, the South American plate. To the west, the Cocos Plate grinding in from the Pacific side. The Caribbean Plate is essentially surrounded, and every one of its edges is a boundary where enormous stress builds up year after year, as the plates converge at a rate of about 20 millimeters per year. That sounds slow. It is about how fast your fingernails grow. But it never stops, and the stress it creates has to go somewhere. Northern Venezuela sits directly on the southern edge of that system, where the boundary between the Caribbean Plate and the South American Plate is not a single clean line, but a broad, complicated zone of faults, a network of cracks in the crust running roughly east to west where the two plates slide past each other. The USGS identified the June earthquakes as shallow strike-slip ruptures on the San Sebastian fault system, one of the major faults in that network. And here's a detail that deserves far more attention than it has gotten. The San Sebastian fault, along with its neighbor the Boconó fault, had already been identified by scientists as potential sources of future large earthquakes years before this happened. This was not a bolt from the blue. This was a loaded fault that researchers had flagged, doing exactly what loaded faults eventually do. And there had been warnings in the ground itself. Just 9 months earlier, in September of 2025, a sequence of earthquakes struck Zulia State in western Venezuela, the largest measuring magnitudes 6, 2, and 6. 3. At the time, those quakes caused alarm but limited damage, and the world moved on. Looking back now, they read like the fault system clearing its throat. So that is what happened. Now let us talk about what the earthquake actually did underground, because this is the part that leads directly to the question of whether more is coming. After a major earthquake, seismologists do something remarkable. Using data recorded by instruments all over the planet, they reconstruct the rupture itself, mapping exactly how the fault broke, in which direction, and how far. And the reconstruction of this earthquake contains a detail that matters enormously for everyone living to the east of the epicenter. Researchers modeled the main shock as a rupture tearing across a zone roughly 210 kilometers long and 40 kilometers wide. And it did not spread evenly in all directions. It propagated mainly eastward. The largest movement on the fault did not happen at the epicenter at all. It happened 60 to 130 kilometers east of it, where the two sides of the fault lurched past each other by as much as 4.5 meters. 4.5 meters. In seconds. That eastward tear is why Caracas and La Guaira, sitting east of the epicenter, were hit so brutally. The rupture unzipped toward them, focusing its energy in their direction. And it is also why scientists are now looking very carefully at the map, at what lies even further east along that same plate boundary. Because when a fault ruptures, it does not simply release stress and leave the world calmer. It also transfers stress. The section that moved 4.5 meters has shoved against the sections next to it that did not move. Seismologists call this stress transfer, and it is one of the most important concepts in modern earthquake science. Think of it like a long line of people pushing against a wall. If the people in the middle suddenly lunge forward, the people on either end feel the shove. The neighboring segments of the fault system, segments that did not rupture in June, are now carrying a different load than they were before. Sometimes that added load is small. Sometimes it is enough, over months or years, to bring a neighboring fault closer to its own breaking point. And there is already one piece of physical evidence showing just how far this event reached along the plate boundary. On the southwestern peninsula of Trinidad, at a place called Galfa Point, the coastline itself was lifted upward by as much as 20 feet. 20 feet of permanent vertical change on an island hundreds of kilometers from the epicenter. The land there does not go back down. That is the signature of an event that reshaped the boundary along a huge stretch of the plate edge, not just at one point, which brings us to right now, to the new shaking. Because the ground has not gone quiet, and this is what has people across the region asking whether something more is building. In the days after the main shock, the aftershocks came relentlessly. The largest arrived on June 27th, and the aftershocks have concentrated in Yaracuy, Carabobo, Aragua, Miranda, and La Guaira, the same corridor the rupture tore through. On June 29th, a magnitude 4. 6 aftershocks struck just north of Carabaleta on the Caribbean coast, almost on top of the hardest hit zone, sending residents of Caracas screaming into the streets while rescue teams were still pulling people from the rubble. The Caracas Metro suspended service to inspect its tunnels. One woman in Caracas said it plainly, standing outside her evacuated apartment building. Here we are again, back in the street, not knowing when there will be a moment of true peace. And the shaking has continued into July, including that magnitude 6, the 4 offshore event I mentioned at the start. So let us answer the question directly and honestly, because you deserve a real answer, not fear and not false comfort. Is this new shaking normal? Yes. And is it over? No. Here is what the science actually says. After any great earthquake, aftershock sequences are not a possibility, they are a certainty. When a fault moves that violently, the crust around it is left cracked, strained, and unbalanced, and it spends months, sometimes years, settling into its new configuration. Each aftershock is a small readjustment. The general pattern, observed after great earthquakes all over the world, is that aftershocks become less frequent over time, but the decline is not smooth. It comes in bursts. Weeks can pass quietly, and then a strong one hits. And crucially, the largest aftershock of a sequence can arrive weeks or even months after the main shock. A magnitude 6 class aftershock following a 7.5 is entirely within the normal range of what fault systems do. It does not, by itself, mean a bigger earthquake is coming. But, and this is the part that requires honesty, it also does not mean one is not. Because aftershocks in the magnitude 6 range are dangerous in their own right in this specific situation. And here is why. The buildings still standing in the disaster zone are not the buildings that existed on June 23rd. Thousands of structures survived the main shock in a damaged, weakened state, with cracked columns and strained walls. A shock that a healthy building would shrug off can bring a wounded building down. This is why every significant aftershock in Venezuela right now is a genuine emergency, regardless of what it does or does not predict. Now, zoom out with me, because the title of this video says the Caribbean, not just Venezuela, and that is deliberate. The June earthquakes were a violent reminder of something the entire region has a habit of forgetting. The Caribbean is, and always has been, one of the most seismically active regions in the Western Hemisphere. The history is written in blood and stone. The largest earthquake in recorded Caribbean history struck on February 8, 1843, with an estimated magnitude between 0 and 8.5, killing somewhere between 4,000 and 6,000 people, with damaging shaking felt from Sint Maarten to Dominica, and the tremor perceptible 2,000 kilometers away. In 2010, the Enriquillo Fault ruptured beneath Haiti in a magnitude 7. Zero earthquake that killed well over 100,000 people and left the capital in ruins, one of the deadliest natural disasters in modern history. In January 2020, a magnitude 7 earthquake ripped along the fault zone between Jamaica, the Cayman Islands, and Cuba, and the region was fortunate that it struck offshore. North of Puerto Rico lies the Puerto Rico Trench, the deepest point in the entire Atlantic Ocean, where the crust plunges downward at a subduction boundary capable, scientists believe, of producing both great earthquakes and Atlantic tsunamis. And the long-term statistics are unambiguous. The wider Caribbean has produced at least 9 earthquakes above magnitude 7 since the year 1900, and the broader Caribbean basin far more than that. Every island arc, every coastline, every capital city in this region sits somewhere on the edge of that restless plate. Venezuela's disaster was not an anomaly in a quiet region. It was the most recent chapter in a very old book. So, is more activity coming? Here is the honest 3-part answer. First, in Venezuela itself, yes, more shaking is coming. And that is not a prediction, it is a certainty. The aftershock sequence of a magnitude 7.5 does not end in 3 weeks. The region should expect felt aftershocks for months to come and must treat every strong one as a threat to already damaged buildings. Second, along the neighboring sections of the plate boundary, the fault segments east and west of the June rupture, the honest answer is that the risk landscape has changed and scientists are actively working to measure how. Stress has been transferred. The uplifted coastline in Trinidad proves the event's reach extended along the boundary. Whether that transferred stress advances the clock on a neighboring fault by decades, by years, or barely at all is exactly what researchers are calculating right now, and anyone who claims to know the answer with certainty is not being straight with you. Third, for the wider Caribbean, the Puerto Rico Trench, the faults beneath Hispaniola, the arc of the Lesser Antilles, the June earthquakes did not meaningfully change the physics of those distant systems. But they changed something else. They changed what we should be able to ignore, because those faults are loading on their own schedules. The same way the San Sebastian fault was quietly loading for more than a century before June 24th, the same way scientists had it flagged as a source of future large earthquakes while daily life carried on above it. And before we go further, there is something this story does not include, and I want to be direct about it, because the internet is currently full of it. In the weeks since the Venezuela earthquakes, you may have seen claims that this event was predicted by planetary alignments or triggered by solar storms, or that someone on social media called the exact date. You may see people now naming specific dates for the next big Caribbean earthquake. None of this has scientific support. No agency on Earth, not the USGS, not any university, can predict the date, location, and magnitude of a future earthquake. And anyone who claims otherwise is either mistaken or selling something. What science can do is exactly what we have described. It can identify which faults are loaded. It can measure how stress moves after a rupture. It can state probabilities over years and decades. That is not a weakness of science. It is the truth, and the truth is what keeps people alive, because chasing fake predictions distracts from the one thing that actually works. Preparation. So let me leave you with what preparation actually means here, because everything we have covered points to the same conclusion. The June disaster was devastating not only because the earthquake was powerful, but because so much of the built environment could not withstand it. Unreinforced masonry, adobe walls, structures raised long before modern seismic codes. That is not unique to Venezuela. It describes buildings across the entire Caribbean basin. The lesson of La Guaira, where 8 out of 10 buildings fell, is that the death toll of the next earthquake is being decided right now in construction standards and retrofitting decisions, and whether families know what to do in the first 10 seconds of shaking. If you live anywhere in this region, the guidance is simple and proven. Know the safe spots in your home, away from windows and heavy objects. Drop, cover, and hold on when shaking starts, because the people who run during strong shaking are the people who fall. Keep water, food, medications, and a light source ready, enough for your household for several days at minimum, because as Venezuela is demonstrating right now, electricity, water, and communications can fail across a wide region at once. And if you live on the coast and the ground shakes hard for a long time, do not wait for an official alert. Move to high ground. The tsunami advisory in June was rescinded and the waves were small, but the next rupture may not be so merciful, and the ocean does not send a second warning. The Caribbean plate is still moving, 20 millimeters this year, 20 the next, the same silent arithmetic that loaded the San Sebastian fault for over a century before it let go in 39 seconds of fury. The aftershocks rolling through Venezuela right now are the sound of the crust settling into its new shape, and somewhere along that same boundary, other faults are still holding their stored energy, still waiting on schedules no one can read. More shaking is coming to the region. That is what the ground is telling us. The only question any of us can actually answer is whether we will be ready when it arrives. If this breakdown gave you a clearer picture than the headlines did, subscribe right now, because we go this deep into real events every single week. Drop a comment telling me what surprised you most, and if you know someone living anywhere in the Caribbean, share this video with them today. Not because fear helps anyone, but because understanding does. Thanks for watching.